"I don't tip," the man said coldly, slamming his credit card on the table. His sharp blue eyes flickered with arrogance as he leaned back in his chair, completely unfazed by the waitress's tired but hopeful expression. Ava forced a polite smile, even though her stomach twisted in frustration. This wasn't the first time she had dealt with rude customers at the upscale Italian restaurant, but something about this man made her blood boil. Maybe it was the smug smirk he gave her as if she were beneath him, or the way he dismissed her hard work with a flick of his wrist. "Sir," she said, keeping her voice steady, "I hope everything was to your satisfaction." The man, whose name was Brandon Hayes, a high-flying investment banker, snorted. "The food was fine. Your service? Nothing special." He picked up his platinum card and shoved it into his wallet without sparing a glance at the receipt. A bill over $200, and he left exactly zero for her. Ava swallowed the insult, nodding as she collected the check. "Have a great evening, sir." Brandon chuckled under his breath, amused by her forced politeness. Yeah, try harder next time." Then, without another word, he grabbed his coat and strutted out, leaving Ava standing there, fists clenched at her sides. Little did Brandon know the universe had its own way of tipping, and his bill was about to come due. Brandon Hayes stepped out of the restaurant, adjusting the cufflinks on his custom-tailored suit. The winter air was crisp, but he barely noticed. His mind was already on his next move, securing a major business deal that would cement his reputation in the financial world. His phone buzzed. "Incoming call. Roger, CEO, Titan Investments." A smirk curled on Brandon's lips. This was the deal of a lifetime. He had spent months negotiating with Titan Investments, and tonight was supposed to be the final handshake. He answered smoothly. "Roger, good to hear from you." "Brandon?" Roger's voice was sharp, cutting through the air like a knife. "We're pulling out of the deal." Brandon's stride halted. "Wait, what?" "Roger, we had an agreement." Roger sighed. "We did, until my board decided to go with another firm. They weren't impressed with the way you handle people, Brandon. Your reputation? It's catching up with you." Brandon's stomach dropped. "My reputation? Word gets around. The way you treat people, employees, waitstaff, business associates, it all reflects on you. We can't risk associating with someone who doesn't respect the people around him. It's bad for business." Brandon felt his throat tighten. "Roger, this is absurd. I built my career on results, not on whether or not I tip some waitress." A beat of silence. Then Roger said, "Maybe you should start." The line went dead. Brandon stood frozen, his heart hammering. That deal was worth millions. His company had been banking on it. And now? Gone. Brandon clenched his jaw, shoving his phone into his pocket. This can't be happening. He refused to believe that a single deal falling through would ruin him. He still had money, influence, and power, didn't he? But karma wasn't done with him yet. The next morning, Brandon strode into his office in downtown Manhattan, expecting to smooth things over with his team. Instead, the moment he stepped inside, he felt an unusual tension in the air. His assistant, Melanie, avoided eye contact. The usually chatty analysts whispered in hushed tones. He marched into the conference room where his senior partners were already seated. His boss, Charles Whitman, gave him a hard look. "Brandon, sit." Something about his tone made Brandon's stomach churn. He slid into a chair, forcing confidence into his voice. "What's this about?" Charles tossed a manila folder onto the table. "Read it." Brandon flipped it open. His eyes darted over the words. "Internal complaints, hostile work environment allegations, losing key clients." A cold sweat broke out on his forehead. "Brandon," Charles continued, "your name has come up in multiple client complaints. People don't want to do business with someone who treats others like garbage." We've lost 2 high-profile clients in the past month. Titan was just the latest. Now, we have investors pulling out because of you." Brandon's heart pounded. "This is ridiculous. I've brought in millions for this firm." Charles leaned back. "Doesn't matter. Your time here is over." Brandon felt the ground beneath him crumble. "You can't do this. I built my career." Charles cut him off. "You destroyed it too." Security walked in. Brandon Hayes, once the golden boy of finance, was being escorted out like a common criminal. As he stepped onto the streets, the world around him felt different. He was no longer the powerful, untouchable man he once was. But karma wasn't done yet. Brandon wandered the streets of Manhattan in a daze. His career gone, his reputation shattered. His phone buzzed non-stop with messages from reporters, former colleagues, and so-called friends who were now distancing themselves from him. By the end of the week, his bank account took a hit too. His firm froze his severance package due to an ongoing internal investigation. His extravagant lifestyle, penthouse, luxury cars, VIP memberships, depended on a steady cash flow, which was now cut off. One by one, the pillars of his life crumbled. His high-maintenance girlfriend, Vanessa, dumped him over text. "Sorry, babe. I can't be with someone who's broke and jobless. Good luck." His former colleagues ghosted him, pretending not to know him when he reached out for favors. His landlord served him an eviction notice, giving him 30 days to vacate his luxury apartment. With nowhere else to turn, Brandon tried to rebuild, but every company refused to hire him. His name had become synonymous with arrogance and toxicity in the business world. Then came the final blow. One night, after weeks of failed job applications, Brandon walked into a small diner on the edge of town. His stomach rumbled. He hadn't eaten all day. He barely had any cash left, but he figured he could afford a cheap meal. He slid into a booth, rubbing his temples. A waitress approached. "Good evening. What can I get you?" Brandon froze. The waitress was Ava, the same woman he had refused to tip weeks ago. Their eyes met, and in that moment, Brandon knew karma had brought him full circle. Brandon's throat went dry as he looked up at Ava. The last time they had met, he had dismissed her like she was nothing. Now, he was the one struggling. Ava tilted her head, recognizing him instantly. Her expression flickered with surprise, then something else. Amusement? No, pity. "Brandon Hayes," she said, crossing her arms. "Didn't expect to see you here." Brandon shifted uncomfortably. "Yeah, just grabbing a bite." His voice lacked the arrogance it once held. Ava nodded, her gaze sweeping over him. His wrinkled suit, his unshaven face, the exhaustion in his eyes. He was a shell of the man who had sneered at her in that high-end restaurant. "You sure you can afford it?" she asked, arching an eyebrow. Brandon's jaw tightened, but he couldn't snap back at her. The truth was, he barely could. "I'll just have coffee," he muttered, digging out the last few crumpled bills from his pocket. Ava studied him for a long moment, then sighed. "I'll be right back." A few minutes later she returned, not just with coffee, but with a full plate of food, eggs, toast, and a side of bacon. Brandon's eyes widened. I didn't order this." "I know," Ava said, placing it in front of him. "It's on the house." Brandon's pride screamed at him to refuse, but his hunger was stronger. He picked up his fork, hesitating. "Why are you doing this?" Ava shrugged. "Because I know what it's like to struggle, and because I believe in something you clearly didn't. Kindness always comes back around." Brandon swallowed hard, guilt hitting him like a punch to the gut. For the first time in his life, he realized, he had spent years looking down on others, never once thinking he'd be the one needing help. And yet, the very person he had mistreated was now showing him grace. Karma had come full circle. Brandon ate in silence, each bite tasting less like food and more like a lesson served on a plate. He had spent his entire life believing that power and money made him untouchable, yet here he was, broken, humbled, and saved by the very kindness he had once scoffed at. When he finished, he looked up at Ava, who was wiping down a nearby table. He hesitated before speaking. "Thank you for this. I don't deserve it." Ava smirked. "You're right. You don't." Brandon let out a breathy laugh, his first in weeks. Ava leaned against the table. "So, what's next for you?" Brandon ran a hand through his disheveled hair. "Honestly, I have no idea." He exhaled. "I lost my job, my reputation, my home. I have to start over." Ava studied him for a moment, then reached into her apron and pulled out a help-wanted flyer. "We're hiring," she said, sliding it across the table. Brandon stared at it. A waiter job, the kind of job he had always looked down on. A test, a chance to truly understand what it meant to serve others. He looked back at Ava. "You'd really hire me after the way I treated you?" Ava shrugged. "Maybe. But only if you've actually learned something." Brandon picked up the flyer, running his fingers over the edges. Maybe this was the fresh start he needed. Maybe karma wasn't just about punishment. Maybe it was about redemption. He met Ava's gaze, and for the first time in his life, said the words he had never spoken before. "I'd be honored."